get pretty fired up about being in the position that I was a few years ago. And so I'm excited to have Javier Miller-Estrada joining us tonight. If you have been around SMSC for any length of time, he's been in attendance. He's been very involved in Emergence really from the get-go, and has been a person that we've really been able to rely on big time. And obviously was a presenter at this last year's SMSC. He was a cohort member in the first ever Movement Academy, which I'm sure he'll discuss a little bit tonight, kind of where his thoughts have evolved since he joined and things like that. And he co-owns, I should say, a business down in Arizona. Is it Chandler, right, Javi? Chandler down there, with two of his other buddies, Rob and Preston, and they're working right now with. I mean, you guys got high school, a lot of college, even a little bit professional. You guys kind of spread the gamut, a lot of different sports, So when we talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, how do we bring ecological dynamics into the return to play process? Javi's going to bring a remarkably unique perspective because he works with a lot of different age groups, because he works with a lot of different sports, and because Javi's background among being a strength coach is also a physical therapist. And so this is kind of his realm and his route. But why this is particularly interesting to me, Javi, and why I can't wait to dive into this with you is because when I was at the college level as a strength and conditioning coach, as respectfully as I can say this, I feel like the return to play process was about as garbage as it gets, at least where I was. And what I noticed, and I can't wait to hear you jump in here, was the return to play process was essentially a bunch of decontextualized, we'll call them exercises, drills, whatever you want to call them, into a couple of laps around the track, and all right, yep, you're good to go. And that was about that was essentially deeming them ready. Now, whether we're talking about a ACL or a shoulder injury or any sort of ankle injury, it just seemed like there was a tremendous amount lacking. And obviously, your talk this year in SMSC was how do we bridge the gap between operation table and getting them back out to 100%, and who does what, and what should we be doing, and how does ecological dynamics live and breathe in that process. And so, Javi, I'm pumped to have you here tonight, man. And so I guess why don't you just kind of jump in? You can give us a brief overview of, I guess, who you are for the people that have never met you, and then we can start talking. I know I have some questions right away. So,
well, thanks for the intro. I'm very happy to be here. Like Rich said, I've been kind of on this journey, exploring these topics and learning from everybody here on this call and locking arms. So I'm really excited to be here. To your point, this is something that I'm very passionate about because I experienced it firsthand, and I've experienced it on the coaching side, watching my athletes go through it. And, to that, what you said earlier, the gap is massive, and it's not really being appropriately bridged to where, an athlete is either runs out of visits or is cleared from PT if it's a collegiate setting, and then kind of goes into practice and kind of left to their own devices. And I just feel it's a disservice to the athlete, and it just doesn't get them, ready for what they're actually going to face in sports. So I think we just need to have a different lens on how we view this problem. We need to actually view it, from an ecological lens rather than just a biomechanical traditional S&C lens, because as we know, sports is a lot more than limb symmetry, a lot more than a hop test, a lot more than a T-test.
So I guess then let's jump there. I guess why don't you walk us through a little bit where you've experienced this personally, where you used to view this, let's say 3 to 4 years ago, and then now kind of where you've come and how far you've come and where your lens has now changed, and just maybe discuss the gaps where all of a sudden you're sitting here like, wow, there is a gap here and I didn't see it, but man, is it, is as big as it ever could have been. So maybe just touch on, like I said, where you started, where you've gotten to, and what do you feel are the biggest issues right now facing, the return to play process?
So from, a personal perspective, I was an injured athlete. I had, 4 knee surgeries within a matter of 4 years. I played basketball and baseball. Don't let the height fool you. I was still a pretty decent athlete. But what I noticed is, looking back on that experience, over 15 at least years now at this point, around that time, is that, when I would get back from, going through my rehab process, I would be on the court and I would notice my body would literally fail me, even though I had, passed all these tests and all that. And it wasn't necessarily that I didn't have the strength, I didn't have, nothing was wrong with the program the way I saw it, but I wasn't perceiving what I should have been perceiving. My ability to perceive my environment was changed because I was devoid and decontextualized from that environment for 9 months post ACL. So that was my experience as an athlete. And then as a coach, working in a physical therapy, well, prior to that, working in a physical therapy clinic, the typical return to play was, ladders, T tests, some type of, maybe some box jumps if we're, doing something different. And, it was never questioned. You just kind of did it. This is a protocol, you did it, and then you passed it along and they were free to go. But you would notice that people would come back. People would come back with a re-tear, with another injury. They would come back or they just wouldn't be the same athlete, which, I think is another thing. You don't necessarily have to be the same athlete, but you certainly should strive to be a better version of the athlete that you once were. So that was an issue from the coaching side. And from what I see now, I think that the return to play environment, it's pretty sterile, from the activities and the drills that are being performed. They're, Tyler and Sean say this, but they're not alive, right? We need to expose our athletes to alive movement problems, even if it's on a smaller scale of, doing some rep without rep with a lunge, for example, or doing some maybe not super contextual representative things, but maybe some novel tasks that have information that available to the athlete. So these are just some of the things that I see. Another issue to me is communication. Like who is responsible for that athlete once they get onto the field? Take football, for example, once they're cleared and they're done with PT, who's responsible for that? The athletic trainer is overwhelmed. They have hundreds of athletes to work with. And then the sport coach probably doesn't have a background in physical therapy or rehab. So that's just, some of the problems that I see currently.
So I guess I have one more here, then we'll kind of, we'll see where it takes us and we can let other people jump in. The ecological dynamics approach obviously has been pinned with this idea of it's a hands-off approach. It's kind of a free-for-all, or it's there isn't a lot of structure to it, which obviously we know that isn't necessarily true. But I think that's the stigma that kind of comes along with it. And when we're talking about a return to play, whether it's an ACL or whatever it is, I think people get this idea that recovery process needs to be super structured and there can't be anything that goes wrong and everything's got to be very linear because, we want to re-injure them in that process. And so I guess from your standpoint now, understanding now how ecological dynamics can actually live and breathe and what it is and what it isn't, can you maybe ease some minds there and just let, I guess give people some context into yes, while that is true, while there does need to be some sort of control in that process, how ecological dynamics can still fulfill that without it being, totally chaotic and putting them at injury or a risk of re-injury.
I think you bring up a great point because that is, I think, a concern. If you're in a rehab setting, the last thing you want is send your athlete back to the surgeon. So I understand that concern. I think where it flipped for me, where I understood, and I mentioned this in the presentation, is that you don't, if a football game, we'll take the sport of football, it's a 10 and something decontextualizes a 1, you don't have to live at 8 or 9. You can gradually bring that athlete along and be a 3, a 4, a 2, depending on where they're at in their rehab process. And so once I understood how to scale information, that's when doors started to open up for me and where I understood that, I can, take some of these traditional drills and put some relevant information, like instead of a cone, I can use a body, and it can essentially be very similar, but just a lot more representative than what they were doing before.
Javi, coming off the back end of that comment right there, I love the idea of information scaling. Can you talk to us a little bit about what would be beneficial to exist in a 2 or a 3, something that doesn't look overly like the sport? Maybe it has information that's similar in certain ways, but can you talk to us a little bit about, regardless of the time frame of the return to play, why it might be beneficial for athletes to get an opportunity to explore that type of an environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of them is, you want that athlete to have autonomy. You don't want them to be overly constrained. You do want them to explore. The other thing is, the degrees of freedom issue, right? When you have freezing degrees of freedom post-injury, we need to explore those degrees of freedom and then free them up so that athlete can then exploit them for later use. So I think, we have to remember that we think of like skill as in this like vacuum that we acquired and then keep it in our back pocket, or an athlete keeps in their back pocket. But if they're away from their environment, they lose that over time. So we have to reintroduce that to them. And that's one of the things where even like novel tasks and things that aren't necessarily level 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 can be very beneficial.
Real
Adam, what
quick
do you got?
real quick before Adam jumps in, just to piggyback on that comment there, I think that the beautiful part about that, and you mentioned it in the middle of your response there, was the ability when they frozen degrees of freedom because of the return from injury, the ability to be involved with a novel task that way that they're not overly focused on something that's very, very specific to their sport. It's something maybe they've never done before, something that they only experience occasionally, and the opportunity to exist there almost to where they can make, and I have air quotes up for those listening later on, mistakes, but they can do it in a really safe place, which allows them to gain experience working through different ranges of motion, being able to use their perception, and then having intentions. And while the intentions are obviously a bit different than they would be in the sport, giving them an opportunity to exist there in a safe place. So I think that part's beautiful and something that is not used enough, and not even just in return to play, but just for athletes that have been frozen for whatever reason in certain activities because the complexity is too high. So that's a brilliant point.
And if I could add one point, it's not just at a motor system level when we're talking about these degrees of freedom. It's perceptual motor system as well. Like, what are the athletes seeing? They're not exposed to the problems. Are they picking up on the relevant information? So that's another thing that I think is important to add.
Adam, jump in, man.
Okay. Yeah, Javi. Just like the main thing that comes to mind when I'm thinking about, when we're scaling down information and perhaps even like lowering the intensity, when you're talking about somebody returning to play, like my main concern, whether, whoever I'm working with, is let's make sure that focused, how do you prevent them from kind of fixating internally? Because if the complexity is so down and they don't really have to focus, or there isn't a big temporal demand on them, then it's kind of tricky not to have the mind drift towards that injury. What do you do to kind of avoid that issue? And then obviously self-organization is pretty difficult when that happens. So I'm just curious how you kind of deal with that situation. How would you deal with that situation?
I think one of the big ones is language, like what you're instructing or cueing your athlete to do. I try to do as many things task driven as possible. So instead of say, I want your knee to go over your toe, I'll have them do maybe a reach for an object. And it's pretty, when they're reaching for that object, or obviously on low levels, this is fairly early, they're likely going to be focusing on completing the task, right? It's whether you completed the task or you didn't. And that's kind of what the focus on the outcome is. So I think a lot of language and how you set up the problem, so it's less of an internal focus, I think is really beneficial.
Kind of working, in that same way. Adam, did I answer your question, or do you got more?
No, I was just going to click, like, it kind of made sense as soon as I asked the question. I'm like, well, just have a very clear goal for the task. And it doesn't even have to be something that's even external. It could be just something, apply specific court, do this as fast as possible. Just a clear intent can kind of take away that focus off that body part that may not be in its best shape.
Yeah, there's an example. I had an athlete that I worked with. I think he had a patellar fracture from a collision, or I forget, it was years ago, but kind of when I first started doing some of this, and we were noticing that when he was, of course it was decontextualized, he was decelerating, but he wouldn't put weight on the injured leg. And so all I did was just have him, and this is definitely not representative, but he would do a different task where he would literally have to reach and grab something. And as soon as he did that, you would see the knee go over the toe and would actually display, adequate dorsiflexion. So I think part of it is when you do get, cue the athlete, and that's how a lot of PT is. It's squeeze your glutes, it's, knee over toe, it's blah, 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 or knee in line with the hip, whatever the cue is. So a lot of it is very internally driven. So I think it's got to start pretty early, to get them to have a more external focus.
And one thing that Adam brought up just got me thinking a little bit, because I've seen it and heard about it. And it's this idea of making sure the athlete is comfortable in the process. And I know a lot of times, especially if it's a first one, I always come back to ACL. Like, I feel like that first ACL for people is just, it really gets into some athletes' minds. And so I feel like it's because it is such common practice, because these closed, vacuum type drills are so common. That's kind of what the person expects them when they're going to go through that process. So I guess, how have you eased their minds? How, because I can just about imagine, and again, I think I've seen this before, where athletes are like, wow, he's asking me to do stuff that might even look and feel a little bit like my sport here, and all of a sudden maybe to get a little deer in the headlight, like, am I ready for this? How have you eased their minds through the process and made sure that they understand, like, hey, yes, I'm going to ask you to do some sport-like tasks, but know this is not dangerous. You know what I mean? Like, how have you kind of walked them through that? And how have they responded since you kind of changed the way you've done things?
I think I'm trying to be as upfront with them as possible, but I do try to. One of the things I try to tell them is we're going to go at your speed. We're going to go at ownership speed. Nothing where you feel uncomfortable. The last thing I want them is to feel uncomfortable while they're doing something and hesitant. So that's one thing I'll do. I'll try to set up the environment to where it's fairly playful in the sense that we're not trying to necessarily like exploit and go 100%, right? We're going pretty low, as far as intensity levels. I explained to them that, hey, the last thing I want you to do is to see your sport again for the first time on your first practice. And once I explain that to them, it really makes a lot of sense, And so I want to bring you along slowly, bring in little elements of your sport. And then typically the response has been pretty positive. Obviously every athlete's different, but when I explain in those terms, they're usually pretty responsive.
On that point right there, talking about scaling the complexity, you've mentioned this a number of times. I know that can come in the form of many things, from more bodies, smaller space, surface changes, something they're not used to, maybe interacting with someone that they've looked up to for a long time, an opponent that they've played against before. I mean, obviously there's a myriad of ways to increase the complexity. When you're working with someone that is returning to their sport, regardless of what it is that they're doing, and you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but how do you know that it's maybe beyond the optimal grip for them? And it could be for many reasons, but how do you, what are some ways, what are some things that maybe other coaches could potentially start to look for in their own athletes, taking into account their own relationship, co-adaptive relationship with who they're working with? What are some ways that or maybe some pointers that you can give us that we could look for in a return to play, as far as maybe the behavior or something like that?
And I think that's the tricky part. You have to watch the athlete. You have to get to know your athlete. This is kind of going in reverse order, but I try to ask a reflection question, at the end of each session. I had several reflection questions just to see how that previous session went. So I have something to build off of. What I've noticed is when an athlete feels almost overwhelmed, where they hesitate, or where they will, if it's a left knee injury, you will see them, even though clearly I'm trying to show them that it's okay to cut on the left, and yet they won't take that invitation. They'll still cut off the right. So these are the kind of things, fatigue, if they're overly fatigued, having a good readiness score or readiness questionnaire, something that you ask them to determine their readiness, I think is important. But I would say watching them basically close part of their movement system off, it's kind of hard to necessarily see unless you're around athletes all the time, but you can see when an athlete refuses to cut off their left leg, for example, hesitate, when they're not solving problems the way that maybe you think they might be able to. So these are signs that I've usually relied upon.
I think there's a lot of great suggestions there, but I really think I personally like the first one and the last one, as far as taking the previous session, and even though they're a different person at that time and there's different activities, there's obviously going to be some carryover as far as who they are at that moment, especially if you're working with them the next day or 2 days later. So I do like that one, because that gives you a good idea, because you're going to come into the session maybe softly assembling some activities, but you're taking into account, you're involving them in the activity design. And that's something I think is lost sometimes on coaches, is that just by asking them how they felt throughout the activities before, in addition to and coupled with what you saw in person, and then maybe what you saw if you watched the film, if you were actually recording some of the activities. I really like that part. And then the last one was golden as well. But I appreciate that, because that's just getting insight from other coaches is so beneficial for me, because we all look, and as coaches, we're all hearing and seeing different things regardless of what the stage is, but especially in a return to play, because that's not an area that I have a ton of experience in. So thank you for that.
Javi, if I could, you've talked a lot about obviously what you're witnessing and seeing from the athlete, or what the expected behavior is for the athlete. How did you find that you were able to get over, as a performance professional, sort of the old way of doing things? Like, talk us through what the old form of life for Javi looked like, and how you were able to evolve into this guy that's living, breathing in front of us now, and living and breathing in front of your athletes in this way, to utilize these ideas in ways that many other practitioners are not, specifically in that return to play space?
I mean, I think my previous form of life was similar to a lot of coaches where, everything had to look perfect. Everything had to look great in a vacuum, isolated from their sport. And then slowly integrating some of these thoughts and concepts and understanding where I can fit in for my situation. I think one of the things is we always worry about, like, Sean's probably heard this. Well, Sean works with ex athletes and, well, wherever you work with, whatever your situation, there's things that you can do to add in pieces of the environment. I don't care if you work in a closet, you can figure out ways to add in. So I think when I started to assess my own personal growth, like, what can I do to add in more relevant information? And then slowly, as we're lucky enough to have a greater space now, you can do a little bit more. Even for us with our current setting, we can't always live at an 8, 9, or 10 because you just have too many sports. So I think acknowledging where I was at as a coach and where I could help my athletes. The other thing is just being comfortable, being a little bit uncomfortable, like understanding, like, some of these concepts are a little bit new. There's not a lot of people that are doing it. But I think if you have a foundation grounded in theory and understanding, where I can, improve, then I think then it makes it for a relatively smooth transition. Not always, but.
No, I really like that. And I appreciate you unpacking that even briefly, because I think you are a great example, sort of a good role model for people who exist in this space, who are performance professionals, but do a lot of work in return to play. So I definitely appreciate that. Kind of piggybacking off of that question, as well as one that Rich asked before in regards to the responses that you've gotten from your athletes, Javi, have you had any athletes who've been resistant to maybe utilizing this more complex approach, this approach that has more alive movement problems? And if so, how did you overcome that, or how did you guys both work to overcome that?
I think the to the answer to that is, yes, I have before. I've had athletes who, when we take this approach, the athlete doesn't always have the answer. It's not like, we're doing a cone drill on the floor where it's pretty much we know what that's going to look like. So I have had athletes, and they don't even have to be injured, but athletes who have been resistant to this because it exposes them. Like, they have to take this journey with you, and they have to get uncomfortable and step out on that ledge a little bit. Once I've explained to them that this, their sport isn't going to be linear. It's not going to be perfect all the time. That my job as a coach is to prepare them as best as I possibly can. So when I explain it from those terms, they tend to be a little bit more open, but I have felt resistance in that regard, where athletes are a little bit hesitant because, it's not, no one, some people don't like being wrong. People don't like not having the answer all the time. They want you to give it to them. And then when you withhold that information, when you don't always constantly cue them, it makes, I think, both parties uncomfortable. So.
There's a few different ways we could probably take this here, but obviously now that we've kind of got this discussion moving a little bit, would love to open it up to the floor and see if you guys have any thoughts, questions, anything that you want to share with or ask Javi.
I can certainly jump in again if if need be. Javi, on that same note, again, piggybacking once again, what types of things have you noticed that are different between maybe the return to play athlete, as well as, or in comparison to the athlete that maybe is fresh and ready, maybe isn't going through an injury, maybe isn't going through a rehab process? Are there differences that you see as far as responses they are concerned, or are there differences in the way that you treat them beyond the information scaling, or what types of things you have to be cognizant of when approaching either one of those athletes in comparison to one another?
I think for both of those populations, but especially for a return to play situation with an injured athlete, you really have to try to put yourself in their shoes as best as you can, considering that their injuries it's not just a biomechanical change that they've gone through. It's just not a physical change. They've been withheld from their environment, as I mentioned before, for X number of months. In the presentation, I used the Klay Thompson example. It's a guy who tore his ACL, has all the expectations in the world to come back, and then tore his Achilles and ACL, or I think, ACL then Achilles. I mean, to think the type of thoughts and the pressure that he might be facing, the anxiety, even for one of the best athletes in the world, in his first game, whenever he gets back on that court, it's pretty tremendous. To give you another practical example, this happened somewhat recently, but I had an athlete who was coming back from an ACL injury, and we went out on the field. I think it was his first time going on the field, maybe the second time, but he wore the shoes, and I don't know why he did this, but he wore the shoes that he said, the last time I wore these is when I tore my ACL. And I was like, instantly like, oh, like, and so I was like, if I'm anxious, what is he feeling? And so thinking about what he might do, of course, I'm nervous. I'm watching him very closely. And then he, we did the warm up. He did a route on somebody, and he dropped the ball, but he looked fine. Then I pulled him over to the side. I said, well, how'd that feel? I was like, I felt good. Like, is it nothing disastrous happened, right? He's like, no, like I feel good. And then he was fine. But these are the kind of things that I think you have to consider as a psychological aspect that an athlete, any athlete really, you have to consider their form of life, but particularly an athlete who is injured or coming off an injury.
Javi, how do you deal with these situations? Because I know, outside of PT clinics, you don't work in a PT clinic anymore. You obviously work in a performance facility. And so when people come to you for these return to play type processes, I know this may not apply to every single situation, but in a private facility, when you may not have the ability to take every single return to play athlete back, in a one-on-one setting, maybe they have to be grouped with a couple of kids, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, and maybe those kids are maybe a different age, they play a different sport. I mean, obviously that's not an ideal situation, but I'm sure it happens, and I'm sure it happens in other facilities as well. What's the biggest piece of advice you could give to someone in that situation where they can kind of carefully guide their way through this process without making it, too much for one person, but not enough for the other kids in the group and stuff like that? Have you dealt with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and it's a challenge. There's also the financial aspect, right? Not everybody can afford to pay for your time one-on-one, and I try to push them to that if they can, but their reality is they're going to have to be in a group setting. We try to keep our group small. I try to pair, so we always do some type of warm up that is a little bit more than your standard warm up. So that is where they do get a little bit of more live movement problems that are somewhat novel, that are a little lower on the representativeness scale. And I try to pair them up with an athlete who I can trust. If it's not me, I'll try to jump in there if I can, because I know that I'm not going to go crazy with them. But I try to pair them with an athlete, and I'll instruct the other athlete, like, hey, so like, I want you to just go maybe half speed or 75%, something to where I know that we're not going to stretch that other athlete too far. So those are some ways, if I can. I mean, I'm lucky. I like you mentioned, I Preston and Rob, so I can pull the athlete aside, which is a blessing. But I do feel like even in the warm up, if they can get 5 minutes of a live movement problems, it's still better than what they're going to get by doing a speed ladder or a hop test for 20. So.
Javi, now that we've kind of been going here for about 35 minutes or so, maybe near that, I think it would be beneficial, especially for those that have been listening the entire time and those that will listen later on, to know where you're coming from. Rich mentioned your facility down there in Chandler. Talk to us a little bit about what you guys encounter on a regular basis. And before you answer, the reason why I mentioned that, I think it's important to know whenever someone's listening, like how someone else goes about their craft. I think it's important for the listeners to know who you're dealing with, because we may have some similar situations out there. And that could be beneficial, because I know that the point you mentioned just then, as far as being in a group and not being able to be individual, a lot of people run into those situations. And a lot of people are working with return to play athletes, especially towards that latter end of, oh, you're cleared and ready to go, but yet you haven't been interacting with anything that looks, feels, or acts like the sport at all. So I think it would be beneficial to hear a little bit about Ignite.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're a private performance facility. We have any number of different sports, which is it's a gift and a curse. We have our 3 main sports, our football, baseball, and volleyball. And as you can estimate, those 3 don't always have everything in common. So We'll always have soccer, lacrosse. So we have, it could be, 3 set sports in a session. We do separate them. We do boy sessions and girl sessions, but there's just, for us, it's impossible to have a junior football session or a senior baseball. It's really, really difficult. From a just a business standpoint, we'd have to have 20 sessions. And then if there was 2 kids coming to that session, then, well, we just, had a 2 kid session, and we really didn't take advantage of our time. So that's where the challenge lies. We try to incorporate some of these concepts, and we realize that at certain times of the year, we have to favor certain sports. So for example, with football, we might not be at a level 10 representatives or an 8 or 9 for most of the year. It's just really difficult. But we know when the season comes, we have to do activities that are going to kind of slant more towards them and pull them aside and absolutely have them do their own thing. That's just kind of the reality of our situation. So it definitely presents some challenges. We do a lot of games that we consider like donor sports that try to cross multiple, skills and sports kind of barriers. So we try to incorporate things like that into, our practice as much as we can.
I appreciate that. That's extremely helpful. And I saw in the chat there, as you were talking, I saw that Brendan had mentioned that he runs into that situation as far as a financial issue 90% of the time. And so I think hearing from multiple coaches the way in which we can go about navigating that situation. You mentioned changing the speeds, or maybe having them move at a 50 to 60% ownership speed that will allow said athlete that's returning from injury to be able to maybe operate in a more dexterous way that's not going to stretch them too much. So I think that's highly beneficial. I have another follow-up question that's entirely different, but it just came to me as you were talking there. I think it's something I'm really interested to hear because, like I said, I haven't worked with a ton of return to play. What value do you place on them maybe winning or having more functional solutions emerge for their motivational levels? So I can kind of rephrase that, but like I think about like the need in that situation. You were talking about individual constraints a tremendous amount, the pressure, the anxiety, the fatigue. I wore these cleats last time that I tore my ACL. I had Achilles injury last time I was on the court in these particular shoes. How do you kind of position or value motivation and the winning or potentially being able to be in a position where it's well below their grip over the field of affordances? How do you go about navigating that space?
I do think, it's obviously athlete dependent. You have to consider each athlete and their form of life, but I do think early on it is beneficial to have your athletes experience some level of success, because having experienced it firsthand, no one wants to be the injured athlete. Your confidence definitely changes. You think of a sport like baseball, that's a confidence sport. All sports are confidence sports, but hitting a baseball is pretty difficult. And if I am injured and I don't have a lot of success hitting the ball, it's pretty deflating. Basketball, with your shot. So I do try to say, early on, I do want them to be more comfortable and win. And I'll maybe, if it's a one-on-one situation, I'll tell them the intent of the session is to like explore, or it's to or for me, if I'm their opponent, I won't necessarily go and try to wrap them up if it's a football situation. I'll just kind of be in their way. So it lowers the intensity and gives them a little bit more level of comfort.
One thing you said there, I think, is really, really valuable. The way that you reframed how they could potentially win in that situation. So winning might be exploring. It's not necessarily about being able to two-hand tag off someone or scoring a point or offloading a ball in a timely manner. It might be seeing how many different ways that they could go about performing said task, or said skill, but kind of repositioning it or reframing it. I just mention it because I deal with that a lot with youngsters, especially as they're growing rapidly, and you have some that are a lot more skilled than others. So being able to put them in position, knowing that maybe the space needs to be a little bit larger, because you do want them to have that level of confidence and motivation moving into other tasks. Because in my experiences, I would imagine it's the same return to play. I find that they're more open from repetition to repetition, or from time they're going to practice to another practice because of some level of success. So I just had a feeling that there was some parallel there as far as return to play. So I do appreciate it.
I think, and we'll put, if it's someone who is a more skilled player against a less skilled player, we'll put the skilled player in a disadvantage. Put them in a situation where it favors it, without telling the skilled player to necessarily like, hey, I want you to lose. You never want to tell anybody that. But yeah, we'll do things like that all the time.
Javi, if you were to summarize your journey and the lessons you've learned for those out there who may be on the fence, whether they're in a sports medicine type of role or whether they're in performance enhancement or whether they're just an outsider looking in right now, they're on the fence in regards to adopting a more ecologically friendly or valid approach versus maybe the more traditional approach. What are 2 or 3 tips that you might be able to give those individuals to get them to kind of get that nudge and facilitating a deeper understanding, of course, beyond joining the Movement Academy, which you've done, and besides picking up Underpinnings, which is currently on sale, by the way?
Well, those are 2 places to start for sure. I think for me, it was just kind of knowing where, again, I mentioned this earlier, but knowing where I'm at and knowing that I don't have to be anybody else. I just have to take these concepts and make them fit me. And first learning from Sean and Tyler, you don't have to be Sean or Tyler. You don't have to be me or anybody else on this call. You have to take the concepts and apply them for what is right for you at the time. And maybe that's dipping your toe in the water. Maybe that's taking like the thing that I always remember is when Sean, we did like a different 5-10-5, a different pro agility. Instead of cones, you just cut out of body. It's very simple, very visible, easy to see. So if you can take and maybe reframe some of these traditional drills and just think, how can I make them more alive? You're already like, on your way there. And then you can kind of fill in the gaps as you go. So I do think it's important to start and not wait till you've acquired this knowledge that is, you obviously want to have an understanding, but you have to start with what you know and then build from there, I think.
Anybody else have anything come to their mind as we've been discussing these things over the last 10 minutes or so? I guess I'll finish with one more, Javi, and I hope this doesn't bring us down too much of a rabbit hole here, but I'm just trying to think of like common things that, like, what is it that's so hard to get over the hump as far as moving in this more ecological direction from a return to play process? And I think one of the things is potentially this checklist idea. I think people love the idea, like, yep, he got his 3-hop test, he's done. Yep, T-test done. And like, there's this checklist, and I literally have seen checklists of like, he can do or she can do this, and this, but can't do this, and this. And I think whether we're talking about the coach, the athlete, like, I think that idea of a checklist is, it just makes them comfortable. Like, they know, like, hey man, I passed all the tests, like, I'm good to go now. And obviously with this approach, there isn't really a checklist, but can there be, I guess, what are things that you look for? What would be your remedy or your solve if an athlete or if someone said, like, hey, that's just something I'm really looking for? Like, you know what I mean? Like, is there something you think that you can, I don't want to say blend the two, because that's not where I want to go with this, but like, what have you looked for, and what has been your remedy to that issue?
I think, I think that's a very good question. I also think that there are some legitimate restrictions. Like, I'm thinking about an outpatient PT setting, and I don't know how many people on this call or watching have been in a PT setting, but typically, you'll get handed the exercise card, or the tech will have the exercise card, and they'll take the person through the patient through a bunch of different exercises. And there is some limitation there from the surgeon, right? The surgeon a lot of times will have a protocol. But you can take, I think, some of those common exercises and interpret them with an ecological lens, or a rep without rep lens. It could be simple as, if we know we have to do a lunge, well, why don't we just have the athlete take a differential learning approach and say, do any lunge, just don't repeat the same one? Or if they can't do rotation, okay, well, we're going to do different tempos on our lunge. We're going to, do some perturbations. You're going to do a squat next to somebody. So someone's in your space, that's going to be a little bit different. I think there's ways to do it on a smaller level if you're handcuffed by any of those factors. So I think you can kind of blend the two. My experience has always been trying to communicate with the PT, take what they say, try to interpret it in my lens, and then somewhat, blend the two as best as I can. I do think that there needs to be a different approach from, looking at people as like this bucket of systems, and instead of this complex dynamic system that we know we are, and know that the protocol might not fit for this person, and know that we might have to slide back and forth, and that let's consider this person's sport. How can a protocol be the same for a football player as it is for a volleyball player? But yet it's universal. So I think it needs to be like a top-down shift in how we view athletes, and then I think that will start to, affect how you make decisions. So.
No, man, I love that. And I think the cool part about that is something you mentioned there at the end, as far as understand that this isn't going to be a linear process. And that I guess that was one of the points I was hoping you would get at some point, where, I've talked to so many athletes when I was working in a team setting, where it's like, you ask them, hey, how you feeling? And when they're in this return to play, I had this setback today. And it's like, they're just deflated and dejected. And you almost would look at them and be like, hey, it's fine. You're fine. Like there isn't going to be this consistent, steady climb. And that's where I feel these checklists kind of get in the way, because I didn't pass this test today. Well, you know what I mean? Like, I just getting them to understand, hey, that's not a big deal. Or, hey, like you just said, these are universal tests. You may, they don't transcend sport. And so it's just a big mess for me there. And I've just seen it cause so many problems. But I love the way you package that. And I guess maybe you can blend them. Maybe you do take it from your lens, and you're using rep without rep approach, and you're taking some of those ideas, but you're just looking at them a different way. That way you're not disobeying a surgeon, or you're not, trying to piss anybody off. You're just trying to add a little bit more creativity and ownership and autonomy in there. So that was a great response.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I think there's different constraints, like controlling speed, controlling the intent or intensity, or ways of getting that athlete to come across that so-called bridge, but in a controlled and slow way. I think, again, it's where we think we have to be. It goes from 1 to 10, and that's a problem for me. And I think we just have to find ways where we can start to bridge that gap a little bit better. So, like you said, it's not linear. It's going to be up and down. So we need to make that expectation, clear of our athletes.
Well, as we begin to wrap up here a little bit, does anybody else have anything that they want to add? All right. Well, Javi, I know I can speak for the rest of us here on this call, especially us at Emergence, man. It's been an absolute pleasure tonight. I love this topic. There needs to be, I feel like we're at the baby stages here. Like this is something that I feel is like these ecological concepts are starting to bleed themselves into the strength and conditioning world. I feel like this return to play process just needs it so much. So I really appreciate you spending the time with us, man. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate you having me. Always fun. I enjoyed it very much. So, and welcome to this anytime. I love these discussions. So,
all right, brother. Take care.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Javi. We appreciate you, buddy.